While I was in the United States Army, I really didn't want to become a non-commissioned officer. I was kind of pushed into that kind of scenario. So let me tell you a story about how I became a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. What's up, my friends? Welcome to this video where I'm going to be telling you the story about how I became an NCO, a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant in the United States Army. Now, before I get started with this story, if you are not subscribed to this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Also, enable notifications so you get alerts as soon as new videos go live, including the live streams, and become a part of that awesome notification platoon. So let's dive into the story about how I became a sergeant in the United States Army. So some of you may or may not know, but I did not intend on the Army being a career. I wanted to only do 4 years, get out and move on to college and other kind of career aspects, and just use the Army as a stepping stone. So I really didn't want to kind of go above and beyond and, be a leader and be a non-commissioned officer. I really just wanted to kind of go up and become a specialist, be a E4, the normal kind of, transition through the ranks and then get out of the Army. Well, it was probably about my 3rd year in the Army. I was on my 2nd duty station in Korea now, and I was kind of being pushed into that kind of area of, hey, you've been a specialist for this amount of time, you're in that window to try to get promoted to a sergeant, so we want you to start pursuing that. And I wasn't really interested in that, but I don't know if it was peer pressure or what it was, but I kind of was pushed in that scenario and kind of just started going with the flow, I guess. So the first step in this was they wanted me to go to the Soldier of the Month board, which is a board with a sergeant major, maybe some other non-commissioned officers, and there's kind of quizzing you on Army stuff, and you're trying to, relay how knowledgeable you are on all these like Army regulations and all these other different Army soldier tasks and everything. So I went into that. I did okay. I didn't win the thing, but I gained some experience about what it was like on a board and what it was like as far as the questions they were going to ask and how to study for it. So I gained that knowledge out of it, anyways, and even though I didn't win, but that wasn't really the main intention anyways. It was just really to kind of practice before I go to the actual promotion board. So it was probably about a month, maybe 2 months later, I'm not sure, but I went off to the promotion board. So you're in your dress uniform, you're going in front of the board, you have the sergeant major. Typically you have the sergeant major and then the first sergeants for all the different companies, but when I was stationed in Korea, that unit didn't have that same kind of layout as a lot of units do. So it was really just the sergeant major, the first sergeant, because we only had one first sergeant, and then you had like some platoon sergeants that were a part of the board. These individuals are asking different questions. They go from one person to the next person and so on and so forth, asking you questions about regulations, about standards and leadership stuff, and having you recite the non-commissioned officer creed and all that kind of stuff. So you're going through that process. It was about 20-30 minutes or so, and then you exit the board and then you find out the results a little bit later. So I found out the results. I did fine. I didn't excellent. I didn't like max it or anything like that and do super amazing, but I did good enough to pass. So I passed the board and they recommended me for promotion. But that's really just like the first step of probably about a 3-step kind of process to become a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army, as the next step would be to go to the school to become a non-commissioned officer. At that time, it was PLDC, the Primary Leadership Development course, later changed to the WLC, the Warriors Leaders course, and now it's BLC, the Basic Leaders course. So I left Korea and then went to my next duty station, which was Fort Carson, Colorado, with the 3rd ACR. Now, I was still in that mindset. I really didn't want to go to the school. I just kind of wanted to spend my time in the Army and get out. So I had already re-enlisted now so that I could get back to the United States, and I just wanted to kind of try to finish out that contract to be able to exit out of the United States Army. Well, I was again pushed into the situation of, hey, we want you to go to PLDC, the leadership course. And so I got pushed into it, so I went. It was a 2-week course down in Fort Hood, Texas. So I went to the course and I actually did really well. I actually made it onto the commandant's list, which basically meant that I was in the top 15% of the entire class. So I did pretty good, and I came back to my unit and, did well. And so then it was now the next step, which I did the 2 hardest steps, so I might as well go ahead and pursue the next step, I guess, at this point, which was to make points. Now your points go off of things like your awards, your military education, your physical fitness test, your weapons qualification, all sorts of things, can calculate how many points you have towards trying to get promoted. And then the points that are required to get promoted just kind of depends on that MOS. If that job field is really over strength on non-commissioned officers, and the points might be really high to make it a little bit harder for people to become a non-commissioned officer. But if they are really low on non-commissioned officers and they need non-commissioned officers in that MOS, and the points might be really low, that way it's a little bit easier to become a non-commissioned officer. At that time frame, they were kind of around the middle-ish area of the points. It wasn't really low, but they weren't high either, so it was somewhat obtainable. So I put in all my information to try to make points, and I was pretty sure I was going to be able to make it with all the information that I had, but it wasn't official until the numbers kind of, came out and made it official. But they really needed some NCOs, I think, in our units. I think mainly for like CQ, which is sitting at a desk answering phones for 24 hours and stuff. And they need a non-commissioned officer to be there with a lower enlisted soldier. And I think they were really hurting on non-commissioned officers to pull CQ and staff duties. So they ended up making me a corporal. Now, if you don't know, a corporal is still the same pay rate as an E4. You're not getting paid anything different, but you just have more responsibility. So you're getting same pay, but more responsibility. So they made me a corporal, and I was only really a corporal for a month, but I was a corporal for this month and stuck in this leadership kind of role of having to do CQ, but also having to do other things that non-commissioned officers are required to do and everything, but not getting the actual pay of a non-commissioned officer. But the next month came along, and yes, I did make points and everything, so I got promoted to become a sergeant and was a team leader. So I worked my way through being a team leader, through being a squad leader, and then eventually being a section sergeant when I went on to 410 Cav. Now, as at this point, I was on my second deployment to Iraq. I was with 410 Cav, and they were trying to push me towards the next level, which was a staff sergeant, or an E6. I was still at the same mind frame, but I was now at a better place to where I just wanted to finish out this deployment, and then when I came back from that deployment, I had roughly about a year, a little over a year, before I was going to be able to get out of the Army and kind of make my transition into the civilian lifestyle. So again, I still wasn't really that interested in kind of moving beyond where I was currently at, because I wasn't going to stay in the Army for a long time anyways. But again, through peer pressure or whatever, I ended up having to go to the promotion board. So a promotion board in a combat zone is a lot different. You know, when you're in garrison back in the States, you're in your dress uniform. They're all in their dress uniform, probably on the board most likely, and they're asking all these, you know, regulations and everything related to that on the questions. Where in a combat zone, it's a little bit easier actually in some ways, because you're not having to be in the dress uniform, because you don't have your dress uniform with you on a deployment because there's no need for it. So you're just in your regular combat uniform, and you're being more asked scenario-based questions, not necessarily what regulation covers this and what's the regulation number for this or that. It's more based on scenarios of what would you do in this scenario in a combat zone and all that kind of stuff. So it almost makes it a little bit easier. But I didn't have a whole lot of time to study for it because I was busy with missions. You know, I was doing a lot of night missions and everything. So here and there, you'd have time to study. We're like in the States, when you're not on deployment, you probably have the weekends to study, a little bit more time in the evenings to study. I didn't have that time to study that much while on this deployment. So I tried to study as best as I could and try to go in there with whatever I could possibly get out of it, I guess, with the amount of studying that I did do. So I went into it, and I was probably a little bit nervous again. You know, it's a nerve-wracking thing. You have the sergeant major and then all the first sergeants for all the different troops in there. And they're asking all these different scenario-based questions and everything. And then you have to do the non-commissioned officer NCO creed. And I remember, I'd be in the middle of one question, they'd interrupt you to ask another question. So it was hectic. They're trying to, make sure you can handle the stress, I guess, or whatever. But there's still a little bit of nervousness that probably came off from that. So when it was all done and everything, I left the room and everything. And at these boards, you have a sponsor, someone who's higher ranking than you that is kind of sponsoring you to be in there, and everything. And then they stay in the room while you leave, and then they usually tell the sponsor the results of the board. So my sponsor comes out and everything like that, and he's like, all right, so funny story. So all the first sergeants said that, you did okay, but they would like you to go through maybe one more time because they could tell you were a little bit nervous and stuff. But the sergeant major of the board, which I had interacted with quite a bit, the sergeant major of the unit, because I was the ammo section sergeant, I was the main person in charge of all the ammo for the unit. I had to interact with him a lot for like signatures and other different approval stuff. And he goes and he says, he's like, you know what? I like him, and my vote's the only one that really counts anyways, so I'm recommending him. So because his vote is the only one that really counts, the other ones are just kind of advising of what they feel about it, but the sergeant major is the one that makes the overall decision to either recommend this person for promotion or not. He recommended me. So then I became a sergeant promotable from that point on. So that deployment ended and came back to the States, and I probably had a little bit over a year left in the United States Army, and they wanted me to go to the school for becoming a staff sergeant to be an E6. At that time it was called BNOC. I believe now it's called SLC, the Senior Leaders Course, but they wanted me to go off to that school to be able to get promoted for that. And I was telling them, I was like, hey look, I got like a little bit less than 2 years. I have like a year and a half or whatever left in the Army. There's no real point in sending me. I'm just going to get out of the Army anyways. And they're like, well, you might change your mind, blah, blah, blah. And I think they really just needed numbers to fill for these slots to send people from the unit to the school. So I kind of got stuck in one of those slots. So for this school, it's MOS based, where the other one is more just general leadership type of, kind of courses to teach you how to be a leader. This one is more geared towards being a leader in your specific MOS. So for mine, it was 5 weeks at that time, roughly around there. And so I had to do 5 weeks of that course, did okay, passed that and everything like that. So that was basically, 2 steps out of the 3-step process to get promoted to staff sergeant. Well, that third and final step is points again. And points at this time were really high for Staff Sergeant. They were 798 out of 800 possible. So that means I needed to have maxed on military education, maxed on physical fitness test, maxed on weapons qualification. I probably needed like an associate's degree for civilian education and all sorts of other things. And I had some of that stuff. I was maxed on awards. I was maxed on military education. But as active duty, I didn't have time to do any kind of college. So I didn't have enough college credits to make an associate's degree to get that to that point. Some people kind of work their way around it where they're able to pay certain schools to take your military education and translate that into civilian education, and then sometimes that makes enough credits to get promoted. In some cases, like I said, I wasn't intending on staying in the Army, so I wasn't going to pursue kind of that route anyways, but I was nowhere near that 798 requirement for points. But anyways, like shortly after I was done with that BNOC, or now SLC, that leadership course, I was no longer even eligible for promotion anyways, because for getting promoted to E5 to E6, you had to have more than a year left in the Army. And I was right out that year, or a little less than a year left in the Army. So the only way I was going to be eligible to even get promoted anyways was if I re-enlisted. And I was finally at the point where I was ready to get out of the Army. It wasn't going to screw me over in a bad situation, nothing like that. So I was ready to actually exit out of the Army, and I wasn't intending on re-enlisting. So I didn't become a Staff Sergeant because the points were really high, plus I was, on the way of getting out of the Army anyways. But that's basically a story of me becoming a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. So yes, it was kind of forceful, I guess, in a way, of me getting into that situation, but I don't regret it. I did enjoy my time in that leadership role, in that leadership position, kind of leading soldiers and, during doing those different tasks that a non-commissioned officer needs to do. So I did enjoy the responsibility. I, at first, didn't want the responsibility, didn't want to go into it, but then actually, once I got into that responsibility role and started kind of, being in that position for a while, I actually started enjoying it and kind of enjoyed being in that position. So I definitely learned a lot from it. I definitely don't regret becoming a non-commissioned officer. Just at that time, I didn't really want to be one, and I was kind of pushed into it, but I guess I'm glad that I got pushed into that situation. So for my viewers out there, maybe if you're currently in the United States Army, or maybe some veterans out there, maybe you've become a non-commissioned officer, or you're in some kind of similar situation where maybe pretty soon you're going to have to make the decision, or you're going to have to start working your way to become a non-commissioned officer. Love to hear maybe your story down below in the comments. Maybe whether it's, I don't want to be a non-commissioned officer, or I was pushed into it, or maybe you have the different kind of take on it. Maybe you really wanted to be a non-commissioned officer because your idea was to, or is to, pursue this as a career and retire from the Army, and you want to work your way up through the ranks, whatever the case might be. I'd love to hear your stories about your thoughts on either becoming a non-commissioned officer or how you did become a non-commissioned officer. And if you're not even in the Army, I'd love to hear maybe your thoughts. Is that something you want to pursue when you get in the Army? Do you only want to use the Army as a stepping stone and then get out? Or would you like to try to, stay in for 20 plus years and make it to Sergeant Major, or whatever the case might be? Leave your comments in the comment section as well. All right, so that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm ChristopherChaos, and I will see you next time. See ya.